Good morning, everybody. This is Judith A. Cope. You're listening to Mad Love. Let's get into it. So I spent the majority of yesterday editing video, but I did come across some very, very interesting research, and I put together a podcast of that research that I found for you guys to check out. It's all about Enron, and really what it is. What I've discovered is Enron was probably the beginning of what I call big fraud, like really big fraud. $74 billion in a bankruptcy, for what was a huge, supposedly successful business. I remember because I worked in a business library at the time. These guys were on the cover of all of those magazines constantly. Business Week, Forbes, Fortune. I distinctly remember reading about them and how great they were doing. But I also remember when Bethany McLean asked the question, is Enron overpriced? And that's back when people did investigative journalism. I think right now we only have Ronan Farrow, who's really willing to go deep and ask uncomfortable questions of people. But yeah, it was quite alarming. And I remember everybody just was thrown for a loop because this company was so highly thought of and it was all a fraud. So I'm going to paste some audio. It's pretty lengthy. Play it fast if you have to, but it's very valuable because you need to understand that this wasn't a lesson for people. It's actually, I think, Andy Fastow, the guy who was behind the fraud, who came up with all these ways to hide the debt, he says it's 20% worse, I think, than in 2001. He said corporate fraud has grown and is worse by at least 20%. This sounds nebulous to you, but when you realize this is where your retirement is invested, these 401ks and all these big companies that you've worked for and they're investing your money, this is the kind of stuff they're investing it in, the market at large. So it does affect you. I hope you enjoy listening to it. I think it's informative. I hope you do too. Please take care of yourselves, and we'll meet back here tomorrow.
In 2001, the collapse of Enron wiped out $74 billion.
Yeah, just an unbelievable amount of money.
Right, and it erased 4,000 jobs. It was really supposed to be the ultimate wake-up call for corporate America,
Absolutely. Everyone thought that was the peak.
But we have a recent PwC Global Economic Crime and Fraud survey that reveals a pretty terrifying truth. Corporate fraud has actually just hit a 20-year high.
Wow.
Yeah. So Enron wasn't a cautionary tale at all. It was like a blueprint.
It completely upends how we view corporate history. I mean, the assumption was always that the sheer devastation of Enron would stop this stuff forever.
Because employees literally lost their entire life savings.
Exactly. Their retirement portfolios were just totally concentrated in company stock. You'd think that would be the high watermark for corporate malfeasance.
Right.
But instead, we have Andy Fastow, the former Enron chief financial officer, who actually went to prison for his role. And he now claims that business fraud today is 10 times worse than it was during his era.
10 times worse. That is just wild to me.
Yeah, it's a staggering claim.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really figure out how that is even possible. We're looking at a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got congressional testimonies, Harvard case studies, forensic accounting journals.
And when you lay them all out, you start to see this structural crack in the foundation of the global economy.
Definitely.
It's like we discovered a massive structural crack in a dam, and instead of fixing the concrete, we just handed all the other dam builders the exact same faulty blueprints.
That's a great way to put it.
And for you listening right now, I mean, this isn't just some dry history lesson. This is the underlying architecture holding up your investments and your retirement accounts today.
Right. It's an ongoing threat. And to understand the architecture of that threat, we really need to examine the actual mechanics Enron used.
Because the banks didn't run away from these tricks.
No, not at all. They didn't run away when Enron collapsed. They eagerly adapted them. And Enron's foundational trick relied on something called a special purpose entity, or an SPE.
Okay, so I see SPEs mentioned constantly in these sources, but in plain English, what is that actually doing?
Well, think of an SPE as a corporate shell company. It's like a separate little box that Enron created.
Okay.
And they use these boxes to hide massive amounts of toxic corporate debt and, underperforming assets.
Just shoving it all in the box.
Yeah, exactly. So it wouldn't show up on Enron's main balance sheet. And the key to this whole disappearing act was exploiting a loophole known as the 3% rule.
The 3% rule.
Right. Under the accounting standards of the time, Enron didn't have to legally consolidate the shell company's debts onto its own financial statements if independent outsiders owned just 3% of the shell company's stock.
Wait. So Enron puts up 97% of the risk, finds some outsider to chip in just 3%.
Yeah.
And suddenly billions of dollars in debt just legally vanish from public view.
Well, they vanished from the paperwork, yes.
Unbelievable.
But the actual financial risk remained entirely with Enron. And they combined this disappearing act with a practice called mark-to-market accounting.
Okay, yeah, the sources describe mark-to-market as booking future unrealized profits as current revenue. But mechanically, how does a company even justify doing that?
It relies on estimating the future value of an asset and just, claiming that value today.
Like all at once.
Yeah. Imagine you own a commercial building and you sign a 10-year lease with a new tenant.
Okay, I'm with you.
Mark-to-market accounting, at least in the way Enron abused it, would be like claiming all 10 years of that future rent as cash you already have in the bank on the very day the lease is signed.
Even though the tenant hasn't paid a dime yet.
Exactly.
And they could go bankrupt next month.
Precisely. They were booking hypothetical future profits as current revenue while, using those SPE shell companies to hide the very real debt they were taking on to actually fund their operations.
Wow.
It created an absolute illusion of immense risk-free profitability.
But, okay, there's a paradox here that I really want to unpack. When that illusion shattered, it caused the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at the time.
Right.
The public outrage was massive. So why on earth would the major banks look at that wreckage and decide to copy it leading up to the 2008 financial crisis?
Because the underlying incentive structure in corporate finance, the pressure to appear highly profitable while masking how much money you've borrowed, that remained completely intact.
So the market just rewards the illusion.
Exactly. The market rewards the illusion. So instead of regulators completely banning the practice of off-balance sheet entities, the accounting standards just evolved. They created a new vehicle called a qualifying special purpose entity, or a QSPE.
You're kidding. They just added the word qualifying to the front of it.
Pretty much. It was a disastrous concession. Former FDIC chairperson Sheila Bair actually highlighted this in her congressional testimony.
I remember reading that part.
She pointed out that banks took Enron's structural playbook and used these QSPEs to dump toxic subprime mortgages off their books just to evade banking capital rules.
So they were doing the exact same thing.
Yes. Sponsoring banks would take a massive pool of risky mortgages and slice them into what are called risk tranches.
Okay, let's break down tranches for a second because that term gets thrown around a lot in 2008 postmortems.
Sure. Think of a pool of mortgages like a giant layered cake.
Okay.
The top layer is considered very safe. Those are the people who always pay their mortgages on time.
Right.
The bottom layer is highly toxic. Those are the subprime loans that are super likely to default.
The risky stuff.
Yeah. So the banks would slice off the safe top layers and sell them to third-party hedge funds. By doing this, they claimed they no longer own the whole cake, right? Which allowed them to avoid consolidating the debt on their own books.
But covertly, they kept the bottom layer.
Exactly. They retained that highly toxic bottom layer, keeping all the catastrophic downside risk.
The scale of this in the sources is almost hard to comprehend. I mean, by March 2008, Citigroup had accumulated $1.1 trillion in off-balance sheet entities.
It's just massive.
And $760 billion of that was sitting in these QSPEs. And then, you have Lehman Brothers, who pushed this logic even further with their Repo 105 program.
Oh, Repo 105 is a perfect example of Enron's legacy. So Lehman Brothers was massively over-leveraged, meaning they had borrowed far too much money.
Right.
But as a publicly traded company, they had to release a snapshot of their financial health at the end of every quarter.
And obviously, you don't want to look broke on picture day.
Exactly. So Lehman exploited an accounting loophole to temporarily classify short-term loans as outright sales of assets.
Wait, I need to push back on that. How is that not just blatant criminal lying on a balance sheet? If I take out a loan, I have to pay it back. I haven't sold anything.
It functions like a pawn shop, but scaled up to billions of dollars.
Okay, a pawn shop.
Yeah, if you take your television to a pawn shop, you get $100. You sign an agreement to buy the TV back a few days later for, say, $105.
Right.
Technically, for those few days, the pawn shop holds the TV and you hold the cash. Lehman did this with billions in toxic assets right before the quarter ended.
Oh, boy.
So on paper, it looked like they had sold the assets and were flush with cash. Then, a few days into the new quarter, after the financial snapshot was published, they bought the assets back.
It was pure window dressing. They just used complex structural arbitrage to legally distort reality.
Exactly like Enron.
Which naturally leads to the question of regulation, right? When the public realized trillions were hidden in these vehicles, the immediate reaction was to demand stricter rules.
Oh, definitely.
And we got sweeping new laws. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, commonly known as SOX, I mean, that was supposed to fix this.
And to be fair, SOX did introduce massive changes. It required CEOs and CFOs to personally certify the accuracy of their financial statements under threat of criminal penalties.
Right.
It also created the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to police the auditing profession. And initially, it actually did succeed in reducing the number of public company accounting scandals.
But the sources say it had a critical flaw, right? Something to do with internal controls.
Yeah, critics point out a massive structural flaw. This is Section 404.
Right, the requirement for management to assess the effectiveness of their internal financial reporting.
Yes. Critics argue Section 404 created a really dangerous tick-the-box mentality.
A tick-the-box mentality.
Literal compliance with incredibly complex mechanical rules became the ultimate goal, completely overshadowing the actual economic truth.
I see.
It became a triumph of form over substance. As long as a company followed the literal letter of the accounting rules, boards of directors and the investing public felt this false sense of security.
Even as extreme systemic risk built up in the shadows.
Exactly.
I'm trying to picture how that works in practice. It's almost like, think about a teenager who is given a strict curfew of 11 p.m. by their parents. Technically, if they are standing on the front porch at 10:59 p.m., they have obeyed the rule. But they are actively throwing a massive destructive party on the front lawn.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
They completely violated the principle of what the parents wanted, which is safety and responsibility, while flawlessly executing the mechanical rule.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The focus shifts entirely to the clock, ignoring the burning lawn. And honestly, no one articulates this danger more clearly today than Andy Fastow himself.
The Enron CFO.
Right. In his business ethics lectures, Fastow makes a chilling point. The highly volatile, off-balance sheet transactions he orchestrated at Enron were technically permitted by the laws and regulations of that era.
So he made sure he was on the porch at 10:59.
Exactly. He had lawyers and accountants review the structures and sign off on them. Fastow warns that merely obeying the rules is deeply insufficient.
Because you can just game the system.
Right. He argues the core problem driving modern corporate misconduct is this exact over-reliance on rules rather than principles. When the system is entirely rules-based, executives can easily rationalize exploiting the murky areas.
They tell themselves they aren't breaking the law, they are just, like, innovating within it.
Exactly.
And the sources show he doesn't just apply this to Enron. Fastow points to organizations like General Motors, IBM, the nation of Greece, and even Apple's tax practices.
Yeah, as modern examples.
Examples of entities taking highly risky but technically allowable actions that violate core principles. They optimize their behavior right up to the very edge of the bright line.
Because if the regulatory system prioritizes form over substance, transactional designers will simply build financial structures that sit 1 millimeter outside the prohibited zone.
Wow.
Which forces us to look at the internal defenses of a company. If external rules alone can't stop executives determined to bend them, what happens to the people inside the company who actually see the danger?
You mean the whistleblowers?
Yeah, the whistleblowers.
The Enron precedent here is incredibly frustrating. You have the story of Enron Vice President Sharon Watkins.
Oh, her story's unbelievable.
She was a seasoned executive who saw the massive holes in these off-the-books arrangements. And she didn't stay quiet. She wrote a highly detailed warning letter directly to CEO Ken Lay.
A very clear warning.
She explicitly stated the company would implode in a wave of accounting scandals.
And the response from leadership reveals everything you need to know about corporate self-preservation. Lay didn't launch an independent inquiry. He handed the investigation to Enron's own outside law firm, Vincent & Elkins.
A firm that was inherently compromised because they relied on Enron for massive legal fees.
Exactly. They were effectively investigating their own client structures. And shockingly, they concluded there was no substance to her complaint.
So Watkins was neutralized.
Completely. She was stripped of her high-level duties, moved from the plush executive suite to a sparse office on a lower floor, and had her hard drive seized.
They neutralized the threat to the narrative, rather than addressing the threat to the company.
Yes.
But didn't Sarbanes-Oxley try to fix that too? I mean, the sources mention SOX mandated that companies establish internal hotlines for whistleblowers.
It did, but we really have to look at the incentive structures those hotlines created. In practice, they often became shields for management.
How so?
Well, think about where a hotline complaint goes. It typically routes to a compliance officer or an HR department.
Right.
And who do they ultimately report to? The CFO or the CEO? If an employee uses the hotline to complain about the CFO's systemic accounting strategy, the system is fundamentally designed to protect the executive.
Ah, I see.
The hotline handled localized HR complaints, workplace disputes, discrimination, but offered absolutely no psychological safety or career incentives for executives trying to flag enterprise-level risk.
Because flagging systemic risk means attacking the people who sign your paycheck.
Exactly.
The sources highlight some harrowing examples of this repeating in 2008. At Lehman Brothers, Matthew Lee, a senior VP of finance, explicitly flagged accounting irregularities regarding that Repo 105 pawn shop evasion we talked about.
And what happened?
He was met with silence and laid off less than a month later.
It's a pattern. The same thing happened at AIG. Executive Gene Park recognized the catastrophic risks of the subprime credit default swaps AIG was insuring.
Right.
He flagged this to his boss, Joe Cassano. But Cassano's division was generating massive profits on paper from these swaps. Exposing the risk would have halted the bonus train.
So they shut him down.
Part was completely dismissed, and AIG later required a massive government bailout.
I want to ask you, you, listening to this right now, put yourself in that position. Think about your own workplace.
It's a tough thought experiment.
If your career, your salary, your ability to pay your mortgage depended on keeping the corporate machine running, and the historical reward for exposing systemic risk was getting handed a cardboard box to pack up your desk, what would you do?
Most people would stay quiet.
The silence isn't an accident, it is engineered.
Exactly. The internal systems protect management, not the truth. Exposing system-level risk is treated as an act of professional betrayal. And this silence is almost always linked back to toxic corporate cultures that demand growth at any cost. Enron famously utilized a rank-and-yank performance review system.
Rank and yank.
Yeah, every 6 months, they fired the bottom 20% of employees.
That sounds like a recipe for absolute paranoia.
Oh, it was. It created a fiercely competitive, ethics-blind environment. If you missed your targets, you were fired. If you delivered bad news, you were fired.
So employees just did whatever it took to hit the number.
Exactly. And that exact pressure to meet goals at all costs resurrected itself in subsequent scandals.
Like Wells Fargo.
Yes. Wells Fargo's cross-selling fraud, where employees opened millions of unauthorized bank and credit card accounts in their customers' names, was driven by impossible sales targets set by management.
Or consider Theranos, right?
Oh, perfect example. Founder Elizabeth Holmes simply fired anyone who dared to question the viability of their blood testing technology. A culture of unbridled hubris guarantees that the echo chamber of silence remains perfectly intact.
But I want to bring this right up to the present day. We've tracked this from Enron in 2001 through the 2008 banking crisis into companies like Theranos. The sources draw a literal, direct line connecting Enron to the most recent financial disasters.
They do.
Specifically, the massive collapse of the crypto exchange FTX in 2022.
It is a profound historical rhyme. When Enron collapsed, a restructuring executive named John Ray III was brought in to pick up the pieces of the ruin.
Right.
2 decades later, when FTX imploded, wiping out billions in customer funds, who did they call to clean it up? The exact same man, John Ray III.
And his assessment in the sources is striking. He essentially said FTX was using the same playbook, just traded on a blockchain instead of an energy grid.
The parallels he documented are undeniable. Much like Enron, FTX cultivated an internal culture of absolute hubris where leadership believed they were the smartest people in the room.
Right, and they completely lacked balance sheet transparency.
Exactly. They utilized incredibly complex financial structures in this case, interconnected crypto wallets and affiliated trading firms to obscure massive losses.
Just like the SPEs.
Yep. And they aggressively exploited regulatory blind spots to project a multi-billion-dollar illusion of growth.
And the sources point out it wasn't just FTX in the 2020s. Look at the German payment processor Wirecard in 2020. They claimed to have billions of dollars held in Asian bank accounts that simply didn't exist.
Pure fiction.
It was another illusion enabled by complex corporate structures and a complete failure of external oversight.
But, it is crucial that we also examine modern disasters that aren't rooted in intentional criminal fraud.
Why is that?
Because they reveal something just as dangerous about our regulatory system. Consider the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, in 2023.
Okay, let's talk about SVB.
SVB wasn't running a criminal scheme like Enron or FTX. However, they were a victim of the exact same rules-based blind spot we discussed earlier with Sarbanes-Oxley.
Wait, I'm confused about SVB. Standard accounting says you have to record the value of what you own.
Right.
If SVB was holding assets that lost massive amounts of value, how could they legally hide that loss from the public without committing fraud?
Because they were strictly following GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Specifically, the rules for what are called held-to-maturity assets.
Okay, walk me through that.
Let's say a bank buys a long-term government bond that pays 2% interest. Under GAAP rules, if the bank states their intent is to hold that bond until it fully matures in 10 years, they are allowed to value it on their balance sheet at its original cost.
Regardless of what the open market is doing.
Regardless of the market.
Okay, but what happens when the Federal Reserve rapidly hikes interest rates?
That is exactly what happened. Suddenly, brand new bonds are paying 5% interest. Nobody in the open market wants to buy SVB's old 2% bond.
So the actual market value of SVB's bond portfolio plummeted.
Exactly. They were sitting on billions of dollars in unrealized losses.
But because of that held-to-maturity rule, they didn't have to admit those losses on their balance sheet.
They literally checked the box. They were in full, literal compliance with the complex accounting rules.
But that compliance legally hid a silent, multi-billion-dollar destruction of asset values.
Exactly. And when the market finally realized that the economic truth of the bank was completely disconnected from the regulatory paperwork, panic set in, triggering a catastrophic bank run.
So what does this all mean for the watchdogs? I mean, we saw the accounting firm Arthur Andersen dissolve entirely because they rubber-stamped Enron's lies.
Yeah, they were destroyed by it.
Yet decades later, whether it's the 2008 banks or Wirecard or SVB, we still have major auditing firms routinely awarding consecutive clean audit opinions to terminally fragile institutions right up to the exact moment they collapse. Are the auditors just legally blind?
They aren't blind. They are just looking at the wrong things. They are auditing for legal compliance, not economic reality. If we synthesize the core message from all of these sources, it is this. The business world continues to treat financial oversight as a legal checklist rather than a demand for truth.
Checklist.
Yeah, we have built an incredibly complex regulatory architecture, but as long as the focus remains on form over substance, smart executives will always find a way to navigate the gray zones.
It all comes back to that dam. We just keep passing around the same faulty blueprints, adding a new coat of paint in the form of a new regulation, and hoping the water doesn't break through.
And until independent corporate audit boards provide real financial safety and actual tangible incentives for whistleblowers, the internal feedback loops will continue to systematically silence the very people who are closest to the red flags.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. In the sources, it mentions that part of Enron's immense hubris was their reliance on complex statistical modeling.
Oh, definitely.
They believed they could mathematically model and trade anything for a profit. And Andy Fastow, the architect of those off-balance sheet structures, is now an investor in an artificial intelligence software firm.
That is quite the modern pivot.
It is, but it raises a terrifying question for the future. We've seen that human executives have proven incredibly adept at finding the gray zones in detailed accounting rules to hide risk.
We certainly have.
What happens when we fully integrate AI into corporate finance? If we train an algorithm to maximize a company's profitability while instructing it to strictly obey the literal letter of the law, will the next Enron be an intentional human fraud?
That's a scary thought.
Or will it just be an AI perfectly optimizing our tick-the-box regulatory system to its catastrophic logical conclusion?
A machine obeying the rules so flawlessly that it destroys the very system the rules were built to protect.
Exactly. We've handed out the blueprints. Now we just have to wait and see who builds the next crack in the dam.